Good evening, panel 2. It is lovely to see BISMHA, Laura, Sarah and Troy for part 2 of our World Book Day event. In this panel, we are thinking about the primary curriculum. So all of our authors who have joined us have worked in primary or have written books that primary schools can really leverage. We get quite a lot of pushback or questions sometimes about the age appropriateness of talking about isms and prejudice and diversity and identity. So our speakers are going to really speak to that for you. So same format. Each of the authors is going to have 5 minutes to talk us through the book they produced, they published, they authored, how it came to fruition. We'll hopefully have some comments and questions from you, the audience. Otherwise, I will do the Q&A at the end of the panel. So BISMHA, you're up first. It's lovely to see you virtually after meeting you in person last term. Tell us all about the book that you've created.
Thank you ever so much for inviting me, Hannah. It's lovely to see you as well. So Amna and Amy. So I think it's a good point to start off with who we actually are as an organisation, because the book itself has been published by Educate Against Islamophobia. So just very, very briefly. So Educate Against Islamophobia, otherwise known as EAI for short, is a UK-wide not-for-profit organisation. And we work with schools up and down the country, so England, Scotland and Wales. And we help them to tackle Islamophobia. And we do that through 2 key avenues. So firstly, through the delivery of workshops to children and young people, and also the delivery of CPD to practitioners working with those children. And then secondly, through the production and dissemination of teaching and learning materials. And of course, that's where the storybook Amna and Amy falls. And just very, very briefly, in terms of the issue that we aim to kind of tackle through the storybook Amna and Amy. So Islamophobia, and in the interest of our audience who's watching, just very, very briefly. So Islamophobia, it is a form of racism, and it is a form of racism that isn't actually just limited to certain pockets and areas within the UK. It's actually a global phenomenon that is sadly intensifying in recent times. And if we kind of rewind to 1997, when Runnymede Trust actually coined the term Islamophobia in their landmark report, Islamophobia, a challenge for us all, they actually found that Muslims were excluded from employment, they were discriminated against in the provision of health and education services, and they were victims of prejudice in the media and everyday conversations. And then if we kind of fast forward to 2017, when Runnymede Trust actually published their 20-year anniversary report, they actually found that Islamophobia as a phenomenon has become a lot more complex and entrenched within society. So as an organisation, as I've already mentioned, excuse me, we're there, we produce teaching and learning materials to tackle Islamophobia, and we're really hopeful that the storybook Amna and Amy actually tackles Islamophobia, and in particular through it within an early years setting.
Fabulous, thank you for that context, because it is stark, isn't it? And a lot of the prejudice we're tackling through our books is on the increase rather than on the decrease. So thank you for doing a book that really gets the younger children engaged in these conversations. So thank you, BISMHA. I'm going to swing over to Laura, the lovely Laura. Laura and I have had so many emails and DMs, and to be in the same space as you finally, Laura, it's not in person, but at least we're on the StreamYard together. It's fab to see you. And I know you've written lots of books, Laura, so you're going to spotlight your newest book tonight, aren't you?
Yes, which is My Family, Your Family. And this actually came about, so just a tiny bit, I mean, I've only got 5 minutes myself. I worked in early years, many years ago, the last 20 years, consultancy work, global level as well. And I created a children's TV show called Jojo and Gran Gran, which is the first Black British animation. Come on. And also I've written a book called My Skin, Your Skin, which is about racism, anti-racism and empowerment. And this is the latest book. So it came about because around 10 years ago, and it's quite fitting because on Sunday we've got Mother's Day. So I was just getting really tired of the commercialism of Mother's Day and Father's Day. And for many of our children, they do not fit into Mother's Day and Father's Day. So I started My Family Week as a celebration. And after writing My Skin, Your Skin, conversation with my publisher, then I wrote My Family, Your Family, which is, you always have to big up the illustrators, which is Giovanni Mendres, and she did a fantastic job. So in this book, I celebrate children who are adopted, children who are fostered, children who live in same-sex or same-gender families. I'm using the correct terms. I talk about surrogacy as well in the book, donorship. I don't shy away from that because that is the reality for many children. I talk about children who may have had a parent who have been bereaved. I talk about children who may care for a parent or care for a sibling. And what I've included in this book, and it's raised awareness on so many different levels, are children who are actually in kinship care. So these are children who are either with a grandparent or another sibling in some cases, I've heard. And I had many of these speakers. I had a big conference book launch in October, and it really touched the hearts and the minds of the audience. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in this book was include the voice of the Gypsy, Roma and travelling community. So over the last 4 years, my leaning in and listening has been to that community. I can't stand here as a Black woman and say I'm anti-racist, etc., if I don't start leaning in and listening. And our learning is never done. We're always learning as, you know, working in education. I'm verbally dyslexic, colleagues, you can probably hear, in education. So Lisa Smith, who was from the Travelling Roma Gypsy Roma Travelling Community, she actually works for the Travellers' Time. She was a sensitive reader on this book. And I met Lisa, not in England, just showing off because I work globally in New Zealand. I said, you're from England, I'm from England. And I always start with, tell me your story. And that way you find out so much. So Lisa and I connected, I recorded a podcast. She's the sensitive reader. And I included the Gypsy, Roma and travelling community in this book. Lisa spoke at my conference, and we've probably all done this as a child, where we've asked to draw our homes. Lisa said as a child in school, she started to draw a caravan. She looked over at her friends and they were all drawing homes. So she rubbed it out. That was the first bit of shame she felt about her community. I shared that last year. I was doing a keynote at a conference. A teacher came over to me, white, visually white, quote unquote. She burst into tears. And she said to me, I'm a teacher, not in my teacher training, Laura, not in any CPD has anybody ever talked about my community. And she said to me, it was tears for joy. Yeah, but I have so much to say, as you can see. But thank you. And thank you to all the other contributors. I'm enjoying it. And thank you for hosting, Hannah.
My pleasure, Laura. And I've gifted your 2 books to so many friends for their children. I know it's on a lot of bookshelves around the country of my personal network. So thank you for writing the 2 books. Sarah, you're another one who we keep missing each other. We've tried to connect so many times. It's so nice to finally be in the same space together. And I can't wait to hear about the book that you published. Was it last year now as well? Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So my book is called Time to Shake Up the Primary Curriculum, which was published actually this time last year. And so why I wrote the book was, so at the point in which I wrote the book, I started writing the book, I was a deputy head teacher. And I've always led on curriculum. I've always tried to create a representative curriculum so that all children can be seen. And in the wake of George Floyd and the sort of resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, I started to really take the time to really reflect on my own lived experience as a child within education, as a young person within education. And then I started to wonder whether other people had the same experiences. So I sit at an intersection of being a mixed race female, and I'm also queer. And so I started to kind of do a little bit of research around different educators, and I found that lots of people had similar experiences. So what I wanted to do is I initially rewrote the curriculum in my own school to make sure that it was inclusive of lots of different voices, to try and kind of disrupt the white-centric, heteronormative narrative, which threads throughout our curriculum, throughout the national curriculum, actually, but that's a different conversation. And so I tried to kind of develop each subject separately. So it included the voices and the perspectives of people of colour, women, neurodiversity, LGBTQIA+ community. And then, yeah, so I did the curriculum at my own school, and it was really successful. Lots of children made lots of progress and engagement improved. And I wrote a tweet about it, and somebody got in contact and said, that sounds great. Do you want to write a book about it? I literally never thought about writing a book. And I said, yeah, okay, fine. So he gave me a contact for somebody at Bloomsbury. And I honestly never thought, A, that I could ever write a book, or B, that if I did decide to write a book, that anyone would ever say yes to my idea. And they did. So that's sort of how that happened, which was really, really lovely. And kind of in between all of this happening was lockdown. I left a really I left a marriage that I wasn't feeling particularly safe in, and I also lost my dad, and it all happened at one time. So I found writing the book a real amazing experience, actually, transformational, really. And I guess the impact that I would like it to have is, I really want people, educators, to move from this idea of a diverse curriculum as something being static. Like, oh, we've looked at it and we've included X, Y, and Z voices, we're done. It's not that at all. We are constantly on a journey, and I would love to say, and I hope that actually we've moved on even further from when this was published last year. I would really love educators to think about that kind of struggle versus joy dichotomy, in that, okay, yes, that's great if we can include lots of Black voices, for example, but if all that we're presenting to children is struggle, are we actually doing more damage? Is that actually helpful? Is that actually diverse? And so I guess what I want the impact of the book to be is for educators to, A, know that it is a journey, it isn't a destination, and B, to start having those conversations about inclusivity, real inclusivity, to be able to audit both the curriculum, but also the people who are auditing the curriculum. Because if it is always the same voices are auditing a curriculum, then you're always going to get the same output. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. I love the title. I love a shake-up. So shaking up the curriculum is definitely something that's resonant with lots of the authors tonight. So thank you, Sarah. Last but not least, Troy, great to see you again. I know you've also written a number of different books. So which one are you going to talk to us about tonight?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to say I really am buzzing with the love in the room. Sarah, a lot of what you're saying there, it's kind of resonated very much with me. I'm a former head teacher as well. I'm going to talk about my second book, which is this one, The Most Contented Snail in the Whole Wide World. And this was the second book in a series that they all promote marginalised sectors. This was my first one. I'm going to share that very cheekily as well. I wrote my first story because two children being picked on for having same-sex parents. And the school where I was working was very white working class, very homophobic, very racist. And because, like some other people who are on here today, they've experienced being marginalised themselves, and I certainly had as a queer man growing up, and certainly growing through Section 28. And so I wanted to give a voice to young people, and also to give representation. And so I was really pleased because Contented Snail, I tend to shorten them because the titles are quite long, but Contented Snail was actually written with some of the children in my school as we'd gone on that journey of developing more open-mindedness and encouraging people to think more diversely. And it was written in response to a Year 5 wanting to be known by different pronouns. And so this book then takes a couple of characters from the first from the first story, and they go off to snail school and meet a slug that wants to be a snail. And I specifically chose animals because we'd introduced pets into school, but also children love animals, and it's actually very difficult to have an argument about animals. So I tried to work through that. I've literally just released my third book. I'm going to squeeze that one in as well. Most Flamboyant Flamingos in the Whole Wide World. And this amplifies the voice of bisexuality. And for me, one of the joyous things that I find now, so I take my books into schools and I lead a lot of workshops, and I particularly use Contented Snail because I encourage the children to write their own stories, and we have kind of like worksheets that the children can use to create their own mini books. And I encourage them to use my stories to parody their own stories so that they can then feel that they can get their voice out, because ultimately the key thing for me is picture books are a really beautiful way of giving visual representation for all. And ironically, this morning I was in an infant school, and I was doing an assembly with one of my books, and one of the children that put the hands up, apparently afterwards the head teacher said they were so thrilled that they spoke out, because they're normally really, really quiet. and this particular child had got two mums, and the fact that he felt able to talk about that, and I'm sure that's exactly how you guys feel. It's about giving people the opportunity to feel represented in picture books. So I think I've just about touched on everything I wanted to there, but yeah, the work that you're all doing is amazing. And thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Troy. And audience, please do pop questions and reflections in the chat there for our four authors on this panel. There's so many things I want to kind of put on there, but I think you summed it up there, Troy, about this idea of helping people to find and use their own voices. That you've all found your own voices as authors, but you're helping young people find their voices. And Laura, I wanted to come back to something that you said about being dyslexic, because I know a lot of dyslexic educators who want to blog and want to write articles and would love to write a book, but they worry that they haven't got the skills to do that. How did you navigate your dyslexia to find words and to create so much content?
Yeah, thank you for that, Hannah. I had about 600 schools on today for World Book Day on Zoom, and that was one of the questions that came up. And I used to feel really ashamed, getting quite emotional actually, because my sister was quite academic and I wasn't, and I really struggled in primary school. But when I got to secondary school, I found my voice, but I am still this quiet person inside. And I felt, even when I was up until about, I think about 25, and then it was actually a lecturer said to me, just write, Laura, just write on the board, because I was always shying away from it when I transitioned into adult education. And I share that story because it's about, I love the term empowerment. So it's about empowering then the young people when I go into schools and I say to them, who's dyslexic, if I'm doing an assembly, and a few of them put up their hands, and I use the quote, but it hasn't stopped me from what I'm doing. And the quote says, don't let what you can't do interfere with what you can do. And I know sometimes on the socials that I make mistakes, but I think it is important that people don't put me on this pedestal, that I have my flaws, you know, and that I can say that I mispronounce words. Hannah, you're an English teacher, you probably picked it up quite a lot of me talking, but I just think it's really good that where possible, people are able to show up who they are and don't feel embarrassed about it if they can, because some people choose not to. I mean, my older son's autistic. He doesn't like people really knowing, so to speak. But great question. Thank you.
And no, I don't pick it up at all, because I've got a mild speech impediment that I had as a child, and it took me a long time to actually do public speaking because I was so conscious of it. So I try really hard to not then pick up on other people's things, because for me that's the beauty of it and the modelling of it. And I was just thinking about the links between you, Laura, and Sarah, about intersectional identities where you are more than what we can see. So Sarah, let me just pick that up with you, because I mean, race is like the visible identity that you hold, being a woman is the visible identity, but you talked about being a queer educator as well, and the intersect of all those different jigsaw pieces of you. How do you help people to understand the bits that are less visible? Is that quite a big question? But I think there's a piece there about what schools focus on. They often focus on the bits that are visible.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think it is quite an enormous question as well. I think that, you know, for me, what's really important as an educator is to present children with the world around them and the people around them. And that sometimes includes the people within our community, but in communities that are homogenous, it also includes people that are outside of that immediate local community. And I think that, you know, through text and through literacy is one of the most powerful ways that we can, you know, expose children to stories, because actually the bottom line is it's about humanity. That's what it is. It's about humanity. And I think bringing it down to that is the most important thing.
I completely agree. BISMHA, I'm going to come back to you. We know there's an increased level of hate directed towards your community, your identity group, the Islamophobia, the hate crimes. And I think there's often a fear of talking about that in a primary context. So you deliberately wrote a book for a younger audience. How's it been received by different communities? I'm curious for the audience to hear how you've positioned and pitched it to that younger audience.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned that, Hannah, because if we take a look at the research and the statistics, and they show that children as young as the age of 3 can actually exhibit the racist attitudes. So we were very conscious to kind of create teaching learning materials with that age range in mind. And the way in which we've kind of done it is we've kind of tackled the issue through various themes and lenses, but then also through Rudine Sims Bishop's notion of children's literature acting as the mirrors, the windows, and the sliding glass doors. And in terms of the book itself, it follows the protagonist, Amna and Amy, who's quite nervous and anxious about starting her first day of school or nursery. But then as we kind of unfold, as her day unfolds and she meets the various kind of classmates, she notices that there are lots more similarities than differences that she actually had anticipated. And it goes back to that kind of idea of the mirrors, the windows, and the sliding glass doors. So if we just kind of touch upon the mirror, for example, for those children who may identify obviously as Muslim and who belong to the Islamic faith, it's very important to have characters and protagonists that actually reflect them. For those who may not actually belong to the Islamic faith and who may not be familiar with some of the practices of the Islamic faith, it's a very good kind of window to actually see the life of Amna and how she goes about her daily kind of her life and some of the practices. And we kind of aim to do that in a very subtle way through the imagery that you'll see. So for example, you'll see in Amna's bedroom that there's a primer on the floor, just very gently touching on those aspects of Islamic identity. And in terms of how it's been kind of received by the community, just yesterday actually I was at an event in Westminster, and there was a lady who approached me and she said that she's got a 3-year-old grandson who she's read the storybook to, and he's just so keen every night to read the story over and over again. And I think part of that, kind of what reflects that kind of excitement in children, young people, is that strong imagery. And we're very conscious as well when we were creating the storybook to make sure that it was very much rich in those images. And that's the kind of core theme and context throughout the theme or throughout the course of the book.
Brilliant, thank you, BISMHA. And staying on the thread of imagery, Troy, I was just googling the book. I love the book Tango Makes Three, or Tango Comes Three, and the penguins, and how we introduce what might seem like adult themes, but through animal imagery. Was that a conscious decision to use animals as a vehicle because of how much fear and pushback and stigma there is sometimes talking about LGBTQ identities within a primary classroom? Do you want to speak a little bit more about your positioning?
Yeah, so ironically, actually, we have used Tango Makes Three, and I love that story. The children really love that story. So when I first arrived at the school, there were lots of homophobic and racist remarks that were just being bandied about in the playground and not being challenged. And part of the reason why I decided to go down the route of using animals was because, as I said, we'd introduced animals into the school. And for me, it gets around the whole, because I think a lot of this is around fear. And people are, prejudices are born in fear. And so I think if we kind of open people's minds and do it in a gentle format, BISMHA, I think what you're saying about the subtleties of images within picture books, it's a great thing. And for me, it's that subtlety of, well, actually, it's a family of flamingos over my back, over my shoulder there. Or it's just a couple of mummy snails. And so you can lighten the discussion, and that then opens up to have more in-depth conversations. And I mean, I've used my books with children as young as 4, 3 and 4. And in fact, actually, I had a reading session where, and the youngest child there was 6 weeks old. And it's about exposing the children to these images now, and when they are very young. And then you can use the same books to actually talk about the rationale behind developing the books. And I've literally worked in primary school and secondary this week, talking about using the same books, but from a different perspective.
Brilliant, thank you, Troy. I'm going to come back to Laura for my final question, because we've talked in the previous panel about like going from a podcast to a book or Instagram to a book, but you've got animation, like you've got a whole different scale, Laura. How did you end up creating animation? And if people are curious about that pathway, any tips?
Yeah, because I was doing the consultancy work with brands, sort of like leaning in on the diversity and inclusion with family life, children. I was working on a TV show. I had already written the first Jojo and Gran book. A colleague from the BBC was there. Went over to have a cup of tea and I said, oh, I've got an idea. But actually it was rejected 4 or 5 times. But one of the things that I do is, because I always get asked, how do I do children's books? How do I do children's TV? I do a free session once a year called Laura, How Do I? And the next one's in May sometime in the evening. Last year I had about 40 people join on, because I can't meet everybody. I want to help and pass the baton on. So if anybody's interested, it's free. It's for an hour in May, and I can go into a bit more detail. But that's how, and I still do early years education work because I love it. Thank you.
I love that, Laura, and please do send us the details of that event, and we can.
I will do, 1,000,000%. Yeah.
I'm sure lots of people would love to join you. So can I say a massive thank you to our panelists from panel 2. Fab to see you all, meet you all, have you all on the screen at the same time. Thanks for the great work you're doing to really have these conversations right there at the start of education. It's so important. I think so many schools and educators are scared, but you're giving them the tools and the resources to really open up those conversations. So thank you for all the work you're doing. You may now all disappear and go and put the kettle on and enjoy your evening. And we're going to welcome panel 3 onto the screen. So thank you, everyone. Take care.